Hello, hello everyone. Let me know if you can see my screen. Okay. All right, so that's fine. Um, so today we are going to be talking about authorization and not authentication. So we're talking about authorization, how you can give different kind of permission to different users on your platform, if that's what you want to do. Okay, I believe you should be able to see my screen now. So let me know if you can see my screen now. Okay, so yeah, sorry about that. For some reason, what I'm changing on my screen is not showing, and I'm not exactly sure why. Okay, okay, I think, yeah, okay, I think I fixed that. Yeah. Mm. I'm not sure this is the first time I'll be streaming, and I think I did not get my setup right. But you should be able to see my screen right now. So let me just delete this. Okay, so today we are going to be talking about authorization. And what is authorization? So before we can talk about authorization, we need to understand the concept of allowing someone to be able to perform different actions on your system. So you could have an application. So let's say this is the whole of your application. So you could have an application that has different sections. Let's say this is a public section. Let me put this in black. Okay, yeah, so let's say this is the whole of your application. So you have this public section and you have this green space, which someone needs some sort of authentication to get into. That's, you need to say that this person, you need to identify the person that is getting into this particular system here. So this public section is literally public. You don't need any sort of identification to be able to enter this. But then within what we are talking about today is how you allow different actions to be performed within this particular space where you already have authentication. So let's say this whole thing, this whole white space, let's say this whole white space is your application. So let me just rename this application itself. And you have several resources in the application. So let's say you have user resources, and in each user resource you have like different actions. So the action could be get single user or get me. Then you can have something like update user, delete user. Okay, so in this application you can have several resources. You can have like users, you can have let's say blog posts, for instance, and here it will be, okay, let's just change this to get single. Let me change this to updates, then delete. Yeah, okay, so there are two ways you can basically protect your application in this manner. So you can say that for this get single user, for instance, everyone that is authenticated can get it. So, but for get me, is only the person that is logged in at that particular moment that can get this get me. Then for updating user, we know that it should typically be the user that is logged in also. But there are some cases where you only want some particular kind of user to be able to update a particular user. So for instance, you could have admins, you could have moderators. The moderators will be able to get every kind of user there. So in this fashion, we are saying that we have different actors. And let's say the actor 1 is an admin. The actor 2, let's just say the actor 2 is a user. And we also have a moderator. So in our own system, we can define who a user is, who an admin is, and who a moderator is. So now a moderator, let's just give them definition. A moderator in this system could be someone that can get several details here. So the moderator should be able to get a single user. So the moderators should be able to do all the gets and nothing else. Then the admins should be able to do gets, updates, and deletes. Then the users should be able to get and update only the ones that they, okay, that's the user should be able to get a blog post that is for them, for instance, then update blog post that is for them. That's why I just put update auth. Okay, so in this kind of system, we can say that we are using role-based authentication because we are basically grouping different things together across different resources. So for instance, we can just say that this admin can get everything here, can do all the actions here, all the actions here. And even if we have other resource, it will basically extend to something like that. So when we are doing our logic itself, we can just say that the admin user should be able to do all these actions. The moderator should be able to do all these actions across all the resources, while the user can only do the one specific to their own account. Whereas Whereas if we are talking about permission-based authentication, permission-based authentication would look at each action as some sort of authorization mechanics, basically. So instead of listing out actors, what we would do is we will say for users we want a get permission for the users, then we want the updates, then we also want the deletes. So now it doesn't matter who has this particular permission. If a user is coming and we can say that this particular user has this permission, this, that's user gets, if we say that the user gets permission, that means he can get the single user from this resource, but not necessarily getting from here. So now if we are going to do something like this, we need to specify permissions for each action in every resource. So now it means that in this our system now, we can have other permissions like blog gets, blog updates, and blog deletes. Okay, so I think I'm cramping things up a little bit. So yeah, so anyone with any of these permissions should be able to do these actions on the blog resource. Okay, so let's take an example for each of them so that we can actually let's see how they work basically. So let's say this is our own application again. Then we should have an actor, and this actor is named, let me check the comments. So let's say this actor is named Shugo. The role of this actor is user, basically. So now when we are doing our logic for accessing a particular resource, so it could be in a service or a controller depending on how you structure your code. So but typically it will be in a service. So we would have our logic for writing the user service itself. And when we get to the get, let's say get user, basically what would happen is any action that Shogo wants to do, we should be able to do it on the get user since he has a user permission. So I'm just going to say allowed here for this particular user. Whereas if he wants to delete a user, we shouldn't allow him to do it. So it's going to be, let's just say bounced off. So now the logic is very simple, and the logic here is that before you can access get delete user, you have to say that your role equal to admin, basically. And now we can extend this particular logic to other resources. So even if we have a blog service and want to delete our blog here, we are basically using the same logic. We are saying that, oh, okay, for deleting only admins can be allowed to, so Shugo will be bounced off. But if we have another user that is, let's say Moi here, and the role is admin, for her now, when she gets to this logic, we will allow her to do what she wants to do. And once we get to this delete user, since she's an admin, we'll allow her to do it. So this mechanism of just using, should I say, an actor name to describe the person that is authenticating is like basically role-based authentication. And the way role-based authentication works is it should allow you to extend the authentication across multiple resources. But if we are going to take another example from, okay, if we are going to take another example from using the permission-based authentication. So for the permission-based, now, what we are going to do is, since we have two services here, we would list out all the services in both resource. So now, the service would include user gets, user gets, why is this completing it for me? No. Okay, then we can have user creates, then we can have user updates, basically your CRUD methods, user deletes. So we can have the same thing for the blog. Okay, so now if we say that, okay, so we'll just use this same example that we used there. So let's take another user, and the user is Shugo. So now instead of defining a role on Shugo, we are going to define permissions. So now this will basically just be a list. Okay, why did I jump? Okay, this will basically be a list, and Shugo can have permission to get a particular to get users. You can also have permissions to create, and you can also have permissions to update and not delete. So basically, when we get to all these points in the services, in fact, let's just draw that out. So let's say this is our user resource, user service, the service for our user resource. We can say that in this user service, if you want to get user, anyhow you want to do your logic, it should conform to user dot permission has, let me just put it like this, has user gets. Okay, so this is basically what we are going to be doing, and we are going to do this for all the actions. So we'll do this for creating, we'll do this for updating and all. So this particular method would allow you to fine-tune how you want access to be spread across all your application. So for instance, you can decide to create another user that is Mary, and the Mary cannot get, I don't know an instance where you want to do that, but the Mary cannot get users, but they can, let's say, delete, for instance. So this will allow you to fine-tune your authorization mechanism, and when you are actually performing the action, what you are looking for is the particular user, does that particular user have this permission? Okay, so that's basically it for the two. That's for role-based authorization and permission-based authorization. But there is also a third way to go about this, and the third way to go about this is basically mixing the two together. So you can choose to have roles for your users, and you can choose to have permissions, and your roles can also have permissions across to them. Okay, let me just demonstrate that. So let's say we are running a hybrid system, which is what I personally use in my project. I would, let's say, we want to use a hybrid system of role-based authorization and permission-based. Okay, so how we are going to define this is we would basically be defining our users in such a way that they will have both a role and permissions. Then they would also not be limited to these permissions. So now, for instance, if we have, the reason why I say they will not be limited to this permission is they will also inherit any permission associated with this role. So, okay, so to illustrate that, we can say that admins for this our system of blogs and users, we can say the roles here can say that the admin role should have user gets, user creates, user update and deletes, while the user role should have user gets and user creates, for instance. Okay, so this is basically the definition of how our system is. So now, if we have two actors on the system where one is a user and one is an admin, that's okay. Let me just copy from what we had before. We had Shogo. Okay, yeah, this. We had Shogo and Moi. Okay, so in this hybrid system now, Shogo would have all the permissions associated with user, that's user gets and user creates, and Moi would have all the permission associated with admin, which is all this. But the good thing about this system is that we can also have a third user. Let's say Mary. A third user, Mary, where Mary has a role of user, but we can attach other permissions to Mary. So for instance, if she's a user, she should not have the permission to update. So in this system, we can say that, oh, okay, we also want to give an additional permission to Mary with role user, and we'll say she has a permission to update. So meaning if we are evaluating the total permissions that Mary has, it would be all the permission of associated with role user, which is this, and this additional permission. Okay, so that's another way that you can, that's another way you can use the two together. That's using role-based and role-based and permission-based authentication. So in our user service, okay, yeah, in our services, what it will now look like would not be like this and not be like this. You can choose to do it both ways anyway, but it will mainly look like the one from the permissions table. So what we'll just do is we are going to, let's say, to do this action in user, that's get user, we will just get the permission for that particular user, and this permission should include the permissions from the row. So we'll get the permission and see if the user has these get actions, and we'll perform that action if they have the permission. And same goes for other actions like update, create, delete. So this is the most simplified way I can put this, and maybe in another session we can actually code it out in maybe Rust or JavaScript. Yeah, so does anybody have any question? All right then, no question. Well, okay, we'll see each other in another session. Okay, are the rows mutable? Yeah, it depends on how you make your system, but typically you typically want to make it mutable. So, and when you're talking about the mutability of rows, do you mean the permissions attached to them, or the or if we can change the role on a user? Okay, the two aspects, the permissions attached to the role and the role of user. Okay, so in both ways, they should be mutable. But it depends on your system anyway, but in most cases, you probably want them to be mutable. Okay, so Shogo, we are going to get to your question. Let me just answer this. Um, to add to what Steven said, that's about roles being mutable. This system of mixing both role-based authentication and permission-based authentication would give you the flexibility of actually creating rules that dynamically, basically, that's, you're not linking it, you're not tightly coupling it with your code itself, and you can have an interface to like create rules. So because your because your system has mainly been built with permissions in mind, you can say that you are going to store roles in a separate table and permissions in a separate table. So let's mock that out, for instance. So let's say you have a rows table. So in your rows table, you can have let's say the name of the row, and yeah, let's say the name of the row. Then here also you can have your permissions, which would be, it will just have a name also. But then you have a many to many relationship between the two. So that means you can have a separate table now that can, you have a separate table that can be, let's say, rows permission. Then in this table, you just take the role ID and the permission ID. Okay, so let me make this. So we also have ID here and ID here. So when you are starting your system, like you are bootstrapping it basically, you can say that, oh, I'm going to populate the rows table with admin and user. Then you are going to populate the permissions table with all these rows here. That's user get, user create. Then here, you'd create a relationship between the two. So now on the on this table, let me give this color. On this rows permission table, you can now say that the role ID, let me take a text here. So the role ID, let's say the role ID of admin is related to the permission ID of user gets. So in this way, you are going to list out all the permissions and all the roles that are associated with each other here. But then you can also build a separate interface completely. Since this is a separate table, you can create a separate interface completely and say that, oh, you are just going to add to the row table and call the row XYZ. Then attach them to several other permissions. And since your code itself, that's your services, they work with the permissions, it means that you can generate completely different rules. For instance, we can just say that instead of admin and user, we can just say that we should have moderator, where the moderator cannot create, but they can get, and they can, let's say, update and delete. And this also would give you the flexibility of actually deleting them. That's, you can just delete a row from this particular table, from this row permission table. So you can delete them. So it just makes it very flexible. Then at the same time, you can also have a relationship between user and permissions so that you can have several permissions. And because they are just like rows in a particular table, you can just delete them if you want. And same goes for the role. You can change the role of the admin. And this action too could be a permission on its own. So the action could be something like role update for a particular user, or user role update, if you want something like that, user role update. So for a more robust authentication system, I would probably want to use this together. But if it's a simple application, you can just typically use your um, role based or your permission based system. But if you have a system where you can dynamically be giving your rules to people, editing it, creating new rules and all, you might want to use the two together. Okay, I hope that answered your question, Stephen. Oh, yeah. Okay. All right. So the next question is from Bamtefa Shogo. He said, and what are the common mistakes that a junior developer can do while implementing this? Okay. So I would say the most common mistake is actually when you are using the rows table. That's, you are not fine tuning your system in such a way that it will allow you to scale. Let me just put it like that. You are not fine tuning your system in that way. So let me just give an example. Okay, this could actually be avoided anyway. It can be avoided from when you have the requirements for the system. Okay, so let me give an example. Let's start from here. No, actually, let me just use the diagrams that we've used. Okay, so let's say you have a system for this user blog and for this user service and this blog service. So in this situation, that's when you started off the project. When you started the project, you did not know that you would have people like moderators in your project, someone that can come and delete comments, for instance, or delete a particular blog if it doesn't conform to a system. So you create only two roles, which is user and admin. But then you don't want to give anybody the admin role, because they can delete some blogs that they are not supposed to delete, something like that. Okay, so let me just go back to the first example. That's for the moderators. So now, because you don't know that this is happening, you can have a lot of logic that is tightly related to the role of a particular user in your service or in your code, for instance. So an example of this is this delete user. So in this particular method, we are saying that if the role is an admin, then we want to be able to delete that particular user. Whereas if you want to add a new moderator role to this system, so let's say this person is Steven, and for instance, you want the moderator to be able to change to be able to delete users, for instance. That means you will have to manually come into the code and say if the user is a moderator also. Then there could also be another condition, whereas if you are the one that created the particular user, if you are the user, you can delete your own details, something like that. Okay, I don't know why you would want to delete your own details, like when you are still authenticated, but let's just assume that you could. So once you have that condition, you would have to come here and say user.id equals to, let's just say global user.id, before you can do this. So this would add up, especially when you now know that when the rules starts becoming plenty, basically this logic itself, it will continue to add up, which is something you don't want to do in a large scale application. So in a smaller scale application, you can do this and just get away with it. But the main thing here is to know the scope of the project. If the scope of the project is actually just going to be admin and users, you can leave it like that. But if you know that you are going to be adding users, the moment you start getting 3, 4, 5, then you might want to break out of this particular logic and say that I'll just be using permissions. So I'll create roles outside this particular system. But what this system will just do is I'll check if that particular user has a permission specific to that action. So a permission specific to this action will be something like this user delete that we have here. Something like this user delete. So to answer your question now, what are the common mistakes that junior devs can do while implementing this is, one, actually not even related to the code first, not knowing the scope of the project itself. Then two, when you know the scope of the project and you know it to be large, not implementing a flexible system like using a permission-based system. Yeah. So does that answer your question, Shugo, or do you have follow-up questions? Okay. Okay. Does anybody have any other question, or maybe probably something we can discuss in another video or in another stream rather? Okay, Shugo said yes. Moyin says she has a question. Okay, Moyin, let's hear your question. Oh, okay. So Moyin said, if it's a backend API, how can a role be gotten if a frontend wants to consume it? Okay. So the typical flow for handling roles and permissions on the front end is to have some sort of storage on the front end. So typically how your flow would be is, let me do this. Okay, so I'm creating two sections here. Let's say this is the backend. Let's say the orange one is the backend and the green one is the front end. So the general flow that most people use anyway is, let's say user wants to log in. When the user logs in, the user basically sends a request to the backend to log in, and the backend would generate keys. That's if we are using APIs, then the backend will now send the keys back to the user. So let's do this. User receives keys. Can I use an arrow here? Okay, I can use an arrow. Okay. So when we get to this point, the user would, that's the front end. Okay, let me name this. The front end would want to save the information in a particular way, or have a way of retrieving the information at any point. And there's an alternative to this anyway. Okay. So when the front end get the keys, then the front end will be using the keys to get the user details, for instance. So the front end can say get user details to the backend and sends it to the backend, where the backend would reply. We know how it goes. The user will send the user details request, the backend will send the user details, and in that user details now we can have let's say the ID, the name, the role, permissions, depending on how the API is. Or you can also say aggregated permissions if you want to separate them, etc. Basically, so on your front end, you can choose to save this information in your local storage, and when you are doing your logic, you basically be checking for this permission. But the backend will typically be checking the permissions and the role on every request anyway, so you don't need to disturb yourself too much about it. What you are just going to worry about is the user experience. So yeah, okay, so that's one way to go about it. So you can store this detail, so save in local storage. Okay, so this is one way to go about it. So the second way to go about it is handling everything from the backend using cookies. So if you are handling everything on the backend, what you want to do is you can, once the user logs in, for instance, instead of the user generating keys and sending it to the front end, what the backend will do is to respond with like an empty JSON or just a text response. But in the headers of the response, you can basically set cookie. You can add set cookie, then give it any name you want. So token, then put your generated key here. Okay, let's say token equals to generated key here. So now every time, because your cookies are sent automatically from your browser, and you typically want to add other attributes here so that other people should not be able to access it. Something like you can set the domain, you can set it to your own domain, let's say moi.com. You can make sure it's secure. You can set the expiration date. There are a lot of things that you can set here just to make sure that this is secure. And if you set secure, you cannot access it on anywhere on the client side. That's when you're using your JavaScript, you cannot access it. But automatically your browser is going to add it to your header and send it to the backend. And what the backend does is, once it gets a request, like for instance this get user details request, it should check this request and check for this token in the cookie, basically. And once it gets the token, then the token, it will generate a particular response, that's this particular response, and send it back to the user. So these are the two major ways you can use to handle it. If you're using the API, you can either save your data to local storage, or you can use cookie and allow the backend to handle all the cookie storage and the security for it. Yeah, does that answer your question, Moi? Okay, we've been here for almost an hour. That's actually a long time. Okay, so that's answered. If you have any other question, you can leave it as a comment on this particular video, and I'll probably make a separate video to address it, or we can come on stream again to talk about it. Yeah. All right. Have a nice day, guys. Happy coding. Bye.